So, good morning and welcome to another episode of our Impact Room. I'm Holly Beeston, the Utilities Practice Lead at Douglas Jackson, and I'm joined today by Jo Robertson. Morning, Jo.
Good morning.
And Jo is joining me from Jo Robertson Coaching. So you started your career, didn't you, in the energy industry, moved into mobile security and worked in leadership and executive roles before moving into your new coaching role in corporate and life coaching, didn't you?
Yeah, it's very exciting. So I was around 20 years in the energy market. I started at Npower as a team manager and kind of worked my way through the ranks, as it were, including doing new startups. So for the last 8-9 years, I set up new energy companies.
Yeah.
Before, when the energy crisis hit that we're also familiar with, I moved into mobile security for a year. And then it really just felt like my passion is coaching. So my passion is coaching and helping to support other people. So the opportunity came up for me at the start of this year to kind of go for that and do that full time. So very exciting and very nerve-wracking at the same time.
Absolutely. But I think having been there and done it yourself, to be able to then help and coach other individuals across different industry sectors, isn't it, as well? You don't just sort of focus on utilities, do you?
Yeah, no, it's coaching across all sectors. And so I do one-to-one coaching and group corporate coaching or one-to-one corporate coaching. And actually the sector doesn't matter. Of course, in energy, I understand it. So I understand a lot of the challenges that people face. But actually from a coaching perspective, it doesn't really matter what the sector is because the human experience is the same wherever we look. And I think it is really helpful that having been there and having done that job for so long, it helps me to kind of connect in with some of the challenges that people and companies are facing actually with their teams as well, which is great.
Absolutely. And that empathy and being able to sort of say, I've been there, I've done that, I've experienced these things, and these are the ways in which you can sort of navigate and look at new sort of ways and I suppose ways of thinking as well, and different approaches to sort of overcome those challenges. But you and I reconnected through the Women's Utility Network, didn't we? And I know that they're a network that you've been a part of pretty much since the day the network started, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, I think so. So I attended a lot of the very early events and was a panel speaker at one of them, and have definitely seen one go from a new concept really to what it is now, which is a real powerhouse in driving forward that kind of gender equity within the utilities market.
Absolutely. And that's, I suppose, what we're here to speak about today, isn't it? Because we both have that passion for diversity and encouraging women in the utility space. But I think today we're obviously going to talk about being your authentic self and authenticity, but also having the confidence to do so. And I think there's a lot of women in the energy sector, water sector, sustainability, sort of right now that are struggling in their roles because they're not able to be their authentic selves. So I'd like to sort of ask you a few questions really and sort of see what thoughts you would sort of share in with your sort of coaching hat on, but also having been there yourself, I suppose. So are you happy to get cracking with that now?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Fab. So when you're looking at authenticity in the workplace, how do you think that people can present themselves as their sort of most authentic self in the workplace without, I suppose, compromising professionalism or credibility?
And it is very tricky, right? Because although we've taken great strides forward in gender equity within the workplace, we're still nowhere near where we should be. And so there is still an expectation of behaviours, of appearance, of performance, of how you'll interact with others that does sit in a traditionally male mould. So there is still that expectation that when women come into that workforce, that they will adapt to the environment that they're in. So it isn't as simple as me just saying, just go and be yourself. There is still that need to kind of adapt and understand the environment that we're in. One of the things I think that I that I learned from my journey is quite often some of this restriction that we put on our authentic selves is actually self-imposed. So we think that we should be, we think that we should act in a certain way, we think that we should look a certain way. And actually, we're setting that expectation on ourselves because we've been conditioned. You know, we've been conditioned for years that this is how we should be. And so for me, the first step is actually knowing who you are. And this is something that I had a real personal journey with, because I felt I suppressed who I was at a very young age. You know, when I was in my early 20s, first job, I'm an 80s heavy metal chick, you know, that's who I've been my entire life, but I hid it and I
Yeah.
pushed it so far down that I didn't even know that it was there. And so I think the first step is just actually reconnecting with who are you authentically. And sometimes that can show up in little bits of discomfort, just not quite feeling right. And I know that might seem like a really vague way to describe it, but those situations where you turn up to work and you just feel a little bit uncomfortable, this environment just
Yeah.
doesn't quite feel right, there is something here that I'm not okay with, and just really taking time to notice what that is. What I hear a lot from women is things like the odd crude or lewd or slightly racist or slightly homophobic joke
Yeah.
that doesn't quite go far enough that you can, you know, stamp your feet and say this isn't okay. It's more like it's just subtle, and that can make a lot of women feel really uncomfortable, but not really confident enough to say, hang on a minute, that's not okay. Can we step away from that type of conversation? So I think it's that really noticing when you aren't in alignment with the environment that you're in, and being really curious as to why, what is it that's making me feel uncomfortable here? And then that's the first step to starting to be brave and really kind of step out as yourself and actually start standing up a little bit for who you are as a person.
And it's always difficult, isn't it? Because we have this sort of preconception that we have to act a certain way at work and we have to talk about certain things, and there are certain elements of our personality that we can't discuss because it doesn't seem professional. But
Mm,
ultimately, we're all humans and we all have
absolutely.
interests outside of work. And actually, I think, in my opinion anyway, I've seen a lot more personality of
Hmm.
the individuals that I speak with since we went through sort of COVID, and we started, I suppose, going into people's homes to a degree with our
Yes.
virtual meetings and things like that. But I think that's where a lot of relationships have actually really improved over the last few years. But I think there is still that challenge, isn't there, that sometimes you just don't want to reveal everything about
Yeah.
you as a person, which is fine, but then it's knowing where that line is, I suppose, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, and I think authenticity isn't necessarily about welcoming people into your home, as it were. So authenticity isn't saying, right, I'm Joe, and this is what I do every weekend, and this is who I am. You're still perfectly entitled to keep your private life private. I think authenticity is about not hiding who you are as a
Yeah.
person. So it's about not hiding your values, it's not hiding your emotions, it's about not hiding your skill set. One thing that I certainly did as a woman in the workplace, is that I would downplay my capability so as not to impact someone else's ego. And
Okay.
I can give you a number of examples where I would be in a room and I would know the answer, but instead of me just coming up and saying, this is what we need to do, I would be like, oh, so and so, what do you think we should do? How do you, and not in the kind of let's bring everybody together, but more so that they could come up with the solution, and not feel threatened by me as a person. And that's actually really common with women. That is a really common trait that I see, in a number of women I coach, is that they don't want to threaten the egos in the room. And so they almost downplay themselves and act like they're maybe not as clever as they actually really are, or they don't have the solution that they have, so that they don't rock the boat. And so authenticity is about owning your power and saying, actually, I do know the answer here, and if you don't like it, then that actually isn't my problem. And I'm going to be confident in the fact that I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm saying, and I'm going to go away and deliver this solution. So authenticity isn't about let me bare all and let me show you my soul. Authenticity is about showing up as you and not kind of feeling like you have to hide a part of your values, your behaviours, your emotions. And emotions for me is a really important one, because in the corporate world, male emotions are accepted. So, or the way that men express emotions, not that I mean the emotions are the same, but the way they express emotions is accepted. So if a man's like raises his voice slightly, or the odd bang on the table, that's okay. He's passionate, he's confident, he's in control. Whereas if a woman's voice wobbles a little bit, or they get tears in their eyes, even though the emotion's the exact same, passion, driven, all of those kind of things, the fact that women from a physiological perspective might express that with the odd little tear here, that is
Yeah,
not okay. That is not okay. And so we completely suppress our emotions a lot of the time at work as women. We don't feel able to even show passion or excitement or anticipation, because it might come out in one of these emotions that isn't socially acceptable in that environment. And so that's when I talk about authenticity, it's almost like turning around and saying, I'm not even going to apologize for this little tear in my eye. I'm just
no,
going to carry
absolutely.
right on with it. I'm going to keep talking about what I'm talking about. And if someone comes to me and says, are you okay? Then you can open up that conversation about, well, actually, yes, I just feel really passionate about this, etc.
Absolutely. And I suppose that goes on to our sort of next question, really. So many of us feel like when we're having to choose between being our authentic selves and sort of fitting in the workplace, it's that struggle, I suppose, to balance that authenticity with that sort of need to conform
Yeah,
within sort of a workplace norm. So what would your advice be to somebody in that sort of position where
yeah,
they're just not sure where they should draw that line and
where that
how?
line is.
Yeah.
And it is so tricky. And actually, a lot of this responsibility doesn't sit with the individual. The responsibility sits with the company,
Hmm.
and those people sitting at the top to actually be open and vulnerable and say, oh, how am I, am I allowing people to be authentic? And this, of course, I'm talking about women because it's the topic I'm passionate about, but this is the same for different cultures, different gender identities, religions, whatever it is.
Mm.
Am I actually running an organization that genuinely allows people to be their authentic self? So although I talk a lot directly to women, there is also this need at that kind of board and exec level to really look at, do we give people an environment where they're safe to do that? Because ultimately our brains, without us even knowing it, will make that safety judgment. Am
Mm.
I safe to be this person in this environment? And what's happening at the moment is, more often than not, we don't feel safe being that person. Um, and so there is that huge responsibility on our leaders of our companies to actually step up and say, right, I'm going to open this conversation really vulnerably to the people within the organisation. As individuals, it can only ever go to the point that you feel comfortable with that moving to. But
Hmm.
there has to be a little bit of discomfort there. So if we are wanting to kind of let ourselves become authentic, because I truly believe the lack of authenticity for women is one of the reasons why they don't stay. So why so many women leave, they achieve the boardroom and then they're out,
Yeah.
is because they can't be authentic. And so if we are looking at that long-term career, is that we are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable pushing our boundaries of what's expected of us. If you are in a workplace where you do feel safe, I would really encourage people to have conversations with their exec level or the HR team or whoever it is that they can talk to say, look, what can we do more as an organisation to support people feeling authentically themselves? And there's loads of programmes that you can do to support that. So definitely, if you're in an environment where you're safe enough to open this conversation up with people who
Mm.
care, then I would definitely say that's the way in, because actually just opening that conversation is quite freeing. But of course, a lot of us aren't in that environment, right? A lot of us aren't in the place where we're safe to do that. And so that has to be everybody's balance around what can I show of myself, or what can I show of my personality here and still be safe. But what I would say is that a lot of our boundaries, like I said at the beginning, are set by us, not by the environment. So really, let's say someone feels like they can't speak up in a meeting because they're always getting shut down, you know, their ideas are never good enough, so they don't, so they sit in those meetings and their voices are closed down and they don't bother speaking up. Is to actually challenge your own belief in that area, to say, am I actually being shut down, or, you know, is my voice actually strong enough that I can step forward into this space? And that was a huge learning for me. I was always very, very insecure in meetings at the start of my career. And then it was making that choice that actually my voice is strong enough to be heard. And I would keep going. So I would keep talking. And if I wasn't listened to, then I would quite confidently say, could you let me finish my point? You know, if I was spoken over, or can we come back to what I was just saying? Because it's that acceptance of what is it that you're believing about yourself, and is it true? I believe my voice was too quiet to be heard,
Yeah.
and my views weren't important enough to be listened to. When you change that belief and it's like, hang on a minute, I've got something to say here and I'm going to say it, then
Yeah.
that can really help you to kind of step out of that fear.
And what was that sort of turning point for you then? Where did that decision come from for you?
I can't give you one specific moment. Well, I wish I could. I wish it was like I had this kind of light bulb moment.
Epiphany.
I know. I think, you know, the truth is the career was important to me,
Yeah.
really important to me. Um, and it was that realization that actually I was being paid well to do a job. And by sitting back, I wasn't doing that job, and I wasn't going to move forward, and I wasn't going to develop my career. And so it was maybe almost that balancing between, if I want this, then I am going to have to overcome this nervousness and this fear. I have it right now with the coaching, right? I hate recording videos, but I know I've got to do it. So I keep pushing myself out there, because if I want this end goal, I've got to really start overcoming some of these limiting beliefs that I've created for myself. But there's also a shift in confidence. So if you are confident in what you're doing, then it's a lot easier to put yourself out there, and it's a lot easier to kind of challenge. If you feel confident in your position, if you feel confident in your knowledge, if you feel confident in your skill set, then it feels a lot more comfortable to say, hang on a minute, will you listen to me? Because I have something important to say. If you're not confident in yourself, then you're going to be like, oh, everyone else knows more than me, you know, let me kind of sit back. So I wish there was one kind of epiphany, but I think it was just that I've got to be stronger in who I am, you know, and who I am as an authentic person to move forward.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that a lot of the time, to be authentic, it's not about you as an individual, it's about the environment that you're in. So, what do you think businesses and workplaces that are sort of assessing their workplace culture, what could they do to help with that authenticity and diversity amongst their employees? How do you think that they could start to open those doors?
Yeah, and I think it has to be a really conscious choice by the company that they want to hear this,
Hmm.
because we have a lot of companies out there that, you know, International Women's Day, they'll put the post out and they'll have all their inspiring women in their business that one day of the year, but for the rest of the year it goes back to, you know, no flexible working, male dominated behaviors, etc. So you have to actually really want to hear what people have got to say, because it's uncomfortable, you
Mm.
know. And when I have these conversations with men who are really open to this journey of gender equality, I feel uncomfortable saying, but did you notice you just did X and that actually made me feel like this? So these are really uncomfortable conversations to have and to hear. And so organisations have to make the choice that they want to hear the things that are going to make them feel uncomfortable, and they are going to take them seriously and make those changes. I think the creation of safe space is really important, and creating a company with psychological safety.
Yeah.
And you can build policies and procedures. This isn't just everyone feels great when we come into work. This is a commitment to, this is how we will ensure that people are psychologically safe and have a safe space to talk up. But what I would really encourage companies to do is to ask that question really openly and say, how do you feel? Can you be your authentic self when you come to work? Do you feel you have to adapt who you are to fit into expectation? So definitely from a company culture perspective, it's that real openness and vulnerability to say, hit me with it, tell me everything that's bad here from your perspective, and we'll work together on how to overcome that.
It's
I
almost
think
asking those uncomfortable questions that you don't actually want the answers to in reality,
exactly that,
because
yeah.
how else are you going to make the change?
Exactly. And that's the exact point, isn't it? Do we really want to hear the answer? And how often in life do we know that someone's got something to say, so we just avoid that topic because we don't want to hear it, because it makes us feel bad? And not only does it make us feel bad, it makes us know that we have to change, and change is always like a right pain in the bum. So it's those questions that we don't want the answers to. I think you nailed it perfectly there with that one.
Definitely. And I think there's a lot that can be done, isn't there? We're seeing a lot more sort of intranet usage in organizations for people to be more authentic. We've just seen some local events around sort of Birmingham Pride, and the opportunity for some of these really big energy brands to sort of get out there and show their support. But I think it's like you say, around International Women's Day, it's not only having that in the moment support, it's about consistent support, isn't it? And not just sort of saying, oh, here we are and we're doing great around this day that's all about this element of diversity or this piece of authenticity that these individuals want to bring to work. But it's much more about, okay, how can we make sure that every individual is comfortable with bringing their full self to work constantly, consistently, and not just for the moments where the limelight is on. And I think that has a lot to do with confidence as well, doesn't it, from individuals? So we talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and it's regularly used with women, but having spoken to leaders across the different industries, to be honest, it affects us all at some point in our career. So when you're looking at imposter syndrome with some of your clients, what sort of strategies do you feel are important or can be used to sort of overcome, because it is a confidence issue, right? How how would you recommend sort of individuals overcome imposter syndrome to help with their sort of ability and contribution at work?
And I think it's interesting because I think the stats are 82% of people have or are suffering from imposter syndrome. So
Which
that's
is
pretty much
huge.
all of us, right? And probably the other 18%, either, there'll be a small percentage who don't and a big percentage who just don't really get what it is. So almost all of us experience this feeling that we aren't quite good enough, that other people in the room know more than us, that if we make even the smallest mistake, that we've failed. And imposter syndrome is one of the topics I do a lot of coaching on. So I do a lot of one-to-one around imposter syndrome, but also within the corporate packages that I do, even in group settings, we do a lot of work on imposter syndrome because it costs businesses a lot of money because people aren't performing to their best. And actually, there's a huge impact in the corporate world from imposter syndrome. And so we do a lot of work on it. And of course, everyone has a different trigger. So although there are standard personalities, there are standard defense mechanisms, it is different for everybody. And depending on whether we're working in a group environment or in a one-to-one environment, that alters the route quite heavily. If
Okay.
you are on your own, so if we're in a one-to-one group, we will go really deep into the vulnerability side of it. And it is not uncommon for people to cry when we talk about imposter syndrome, because actually what often sits at the base is a real quite mean and nasty core belief that you have about yourself. You know, I'm lazy, I'm not worth it, I'm a failure. So there's quite often these really actually quite mean beliefs that we're embedding about ourselves. And in one-to-one, we will look at identifying that, and we'll look at kind of reframing that and changing that core belief, and then building up from that. So we kind of take the foundation away, and then we build it back up with other techniques and tools. When you're doing group corporate, people tend not to want to cry. So when you're sitting in that group environment, people don't generally want to cry within their peer group. Although that's something I really wish I could challenge, because crying is absolutely okay, but people don't. So we don't tend to go deep down into that core belief in those group environments. Instead, what we focus on is how are you? So what is it that you believe? And it's more superficial. So I can't do a presentation. You're rubbish at presentations. You know, whatever.
Yeah.
It's not about you. It's not I'm a
Technology is not my
failure.
strong point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hate marketing. That's one of mine at the moment, setting up as a coach. I thought I was going to coach, not market. I hate marketing. It's not true, right? I'm lying. I'm creating this belief that isn't true. So we find that belief. So what is it that sits there? And then we do a bit of work where we actually look at how true is that belief, and we actually do a kind of evidence stack. So what evidence is there that that is true, and then what evidence is there that that isn't true? And every time the list for it not being true is 2, 3, 4 times as long as the evidence we've got that it's true. And we then use reframing activities there to reframe that belief. So what can we take? I hate marketing. How can we reframe that so that it's our brains can still believe it, but it's more positive. It shows our skill, you know. So maybe for me, I really enjoy talking to people, and actually that's what marketing is, right? It's talking to people. So we reframe that, and we build that belief back up into a more motivating one. And then the other aspect of imposter syndrome that we do both one-to-one and corporate is actually learning to notice when we do something well. So if you've just done a great big presentation, you'll get off it and you'll be able to pick out the 1 or 2 things that you did wrong. And your brain will be like, why did you pause on that? Why did you stumble over your words there? Why didn't you say X? Oh, you got that number wrong. You didn't know the answer to that question. And our brain instantly lists out everything that we did wrong. And it doesn't even notice everything that we did right. And
It's so easy to focus on the negative, though, isn't it?
exactly. And that's where our brains go, because it's trying to keep us safe. So it's trying to say, if we notice everything we did wrong, we can make sure we never do that again. But actually, if you start recording your successes, so every little thing that you do that's good, that you've done well, then you start to rebuild your neural pathways. So these automatic pathways that are created in our brains, and we start to rebuild them away from I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, I'm not worth it, to actually, you know what, I'm all right at presentations, and I can kind of wing it. If someone asks me a question I don't know, I'm all right in that situation. And so one of the things I try and get people to do is keep a success journal every day, write down 2, 3, 4, 5 things that they've done in that day or in that situation that they did well. And then before you notice it, the successes start coming a lot easier. And as they do, they start to drown out this feeling of failure, these things that we don't do perfectly.
It's almost like reprogramming your brain, isn't it?
Exactly what it is. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And we have these neural pathways are built based on experiences, activities, and they run automatically. So they are like an automatic thought process that happens without us even noticing it, just happens. And that's exactly what we're doing by that. We're almost rerouting that neural pathway to a different end point. So instead of, oh, I've done this presentation, I'm rubbish, it's I've done this presentation, actually it was pretty good. So that our brains are kind of walking a different path than they were before.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that anybody can, we always pick out the areas for improvement, don't we? But I think that a lot of it comes from confidence barriers as well. And I know that it's something that we've talked about a few times, and it's something that we've touched on earlier on in this conversation, but what are some of these sort of confidence barriers that you've witnessed in your, I suppose, in your professional career and your sort of professional coaching career? So how what are some of those sort of more common confidence challenges, and how would you advise that people sort of overcome them?
And it's a complicated topic because the reality is that confidence in women and confidence in men isn't viewed the same.
No.
And confident women are often seen to be, rude, overbearing, etc. Whereas confident men are just confident, right? So there is still a different measure of what confidence looks like in men and women. But I think for women, a lot of our confidence issues come from the way that we're brought up. So we're brought up, to be good girls. I don't know if it's a real syndrome, but I certainly consider it a syndrome of good girl syndrome.
Yeah.
Behave yourself, don't rock the boat, don't upset anybody. From a physical safety perspective, we have to maintain that if we're out, don't upset that person who's approaching you. Don't just tell them to go away, you're not interested. You've got to tell them you've got a boyfriend, etc. So we're taught
Yeah.
not to actually rock the boat. And so
And to provide an excuse as well.
exactly, yeah. And I had this just recently with a taxi driver who asked me out in the taxi, and instead of me just going no, which was my answer, I was like, oh no, I'm seeing somebody. So I had to lie to kind of keep myself safe and to make myself feel protective, and I haven't offended him. There's nothing wrong with you, it's just that I've got somebody else. And that is something that's so ingrained into us. We're taught it from the very youngest ages to not rock the boat, don't upset anybody else, make sure everyone else is happy, don't offend people. And when I talk to women, what I see a lot is this fear, don't ask for the pay rise. Why are you asking for that pay rise? Oh, they might think I'm really cheeky. So what? Why does that matter if they think you're really cheeky? But it's so ingrained in us that feels like the most dangerous place to be, upsetting somebody or offending somebody. And so that for me is a real confidence barrier that I see consistently with almost all women that I interact with, both coaching and even from a work perspective, is that they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to appear rude. They don't want to appear cheeky. They don't want to offend anybody.
Greed as well is one that I
Greed,
witness a lot.
yes,
Well, I don't want to seem greedy, but effectively there are pay scales that are available. There are roles that are defined, and if you are successfully achieving your role,
exactly,
why shouldn't you be being paid for the role that you're doing? It's not
exactly.
greed, it's being paid fairly for your
Yeah,
contribution.
yeah. And we don't feel like that, do we? We think, oh my
No.
gosh, how dare I ask for that much money? And we feel like we're being greedy or rude or
Mm,
presumptuous. I don't mind, I'll just keep working this extra work and it doesn't matter. Um, and the reality is it does feel so unsafe for us to step into that space. And one of the things that I do with clients so let's say they're going for that pay rise conversation, is we write it down. So in that session, we may go through either bullet pointed, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say that, I'm going to do X. And then we build a belief set up around it. So why are you asking for this money? What is it that you're doing that means you're worth it? And that for women who really do find it just so awful to be in that I'm being rude, what will people think of me phase, writing, so deciding beforehand and writing it down and practicing it and rehearsing it and going in with your notepad with your points on and making a decision before you go into that meeting that you are going to ask for your pay rise, no matter how uncomfortable, is probably the step that for a lot of women they have to take. It's not going to come naturally, it's not going to come comfortably for a long time. And so we have to make a decision that we're going to do it. We have to have it written down so that when all the emotions come at us in that situation and kind of throw our logical thought out the window, we've got those notes and we've practiced it and we know what we're doing and we can stick to it.
And you and I have spoken about this because there's a number of women in particular that you've coached that have gone in for this horrendously nerve-wracking conversation and then in reality are met with an, oh, well, I already thought you were in the role
Yeah.
above that you're trying to get now, or I already thought you were being paid more.
Yeah, exactly. And so for us, that conversation is the most awful thing that's ever going to happen. And, you know, that person we're talking to is going to be flipping the tables and storming out and going and talk to everybody. Oh, we need to get rid of Jo because she's so rude. And we've built this whole great big false narrative in our head. And we go into a meeting with a person who values us and respects us, and we're like, oh yeah, of course. That makes total sense. Or let me go and see what I can do about it. Or I didn't, like you said, I didn't realise that's what salary you were on. Because of course we're not the centre of their universe. You know, they're going about their very, very busy job. Jo's happy, she's still turning up all day, you know, every day. They don't know that I'm seething inside because I'm not being paid fairly.
Yeah,
And so when we bring those conversations forward, more often than not, the person on the other side is like, this is really interesting. Not all the time, you know, of course, there's a lot of occasions where it might be like, no, you're not worth it, get out the room. But at least then you know where you stand, right? At least if you are in that situation where you're going to ask for a fair and valid pay rise and you're told no, then that can prompt you to make that decision about, is this actually really where I want to stay and what I want to do? And a really
absolutely.
important step in this is after you come out of that meeting is to make a note of how it went, because similarly as we were talking earlier about rewiring your brain, coming after that meeting and saying, actually, it went really well, or I was listened to, or I got what I wanted out of this. It helps to rewire our brain that those conversations aren't as scary as we think they are.
Absolutely. And even if you don't get the end result that you've achieved, it's better to confront that conversation and know what that outcome is going to be rather than living
Exactly.
in a world of what ifs. And I think in some respects it may be a trigger to look for a new role, or in others it may be an opportunity to actually sit back and think, well, actually, you know, all those extra hours that I'm putting in, all of that
Yeah.
time that I'm investing that's impacting my personal life, as an example, that's going to stop now. And
Yeah.
it might even be that there are other elements of your role that you enjoy so much, but then you sort of take that step back and think, do you know what? We need to work on this work-life balance, or
Yes.
because at the moment I've hit this ceiling, I'm not ready to make a move career-wise yet. So let's just take a step
Yeah.
back and
Yeah.
recoup, I suppose, and regroup
Yeah.
and decide what's next.
And it's about your worth, isn't it? So it's about,
Mm,
when we talk about confidence and imposter syndrome and all of these other things and authenticity, it's about saying, actually, no, I'm worth more than I'm being paid here. And so what can I do about that situation? So even if, like you say, it isn't to go and get another job, but you do make that work-life balance, it's about acting in a way that's kind and caring to yourself and saying, I see that I'm worth more than this and I'm not going to be taken advantage of. And that in its own right will give you that confidence to kind of drive forward. And the other thing about these types of conversations in particular, you know, when you go in one-to-one, if that conversation has come cold to the other person, so if they have no idea and you just drop it in, I want a £20,000 pay rise, I'm really peed off, then in that room they will have had an emotional reaction as well. And they may, depending on the relationship, have felt slightly attacked in there, like, oh no, what's going to happen? This is no good. And so their reaction in that room does not necessarily mean that it will be their reaction long term. And so I would always suggest, if you get a flat no, revisiting that conversation, say 3 to 4 weeks later, saying, look, I want to come back and talk to you about this again. You've had some time to think about it. Because what that does, when you have that conversation, you start this cognitive process with that other person that might take a couple of weeks to work through. And actually, when you come back to it, you might get a different outcome. So for women, we take no as a no. We're like, right, done. I've got a no. I'm off out, or I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. But
mm.
actually, that other person is having a reaction to what you've said. and they might just need a little bit of processing time. They may go and talk to HR, or they might go and have a look on the market and see what's the going rate for this person. And so don't take no as a no in that
Often
scenario.
triggers so many more reactions, doesn't it?
Totally, yeah, totally.
It's like the change curve, isn't it, when you go through the sort of
Yeah.
despair and acceptance, but it's not something that's always going to happen immediately. And I think we've covered a lot, and I know that you and I could probably talk for days
For
about
days,
these
yeah.
these sorts of situations and empowering individuals to just be their true selves within the workplace. But I think we there's so much that comes with, you need the confidence to be authentic, and
Yeah.
you need to be authentic to truly be confident. It's kind of the chicken and the egg scenario, isn't it? But I suppose we've talked about an awful lot, but to conclude, what would you, if you had to give yourself some advice with your coaching hat on now, given your 20-year career prior to
Mm,
yourself when you were starting out on that career journey, what would you say to Joe 20
yeah.
years ago now?
So I could sit here and list out a number of occasions that have happened over my career where I felt really uncomfortable, where
Mm,
I've been in an environment and I've acted in a way that I'm not happy with myself for acting. Um, and it may not be consciously, I may not have been consciously aware of how I felt in that moment, but I could literally, you know, if we had hours, I could say, right, this happened, this happened, this happened.
yeah.
And I felt out of alignment with who I am. And when I look back, obviously 20 years ago, the world was very different to how it is now. But even looking back 20 years ago, there are things that I could have done safely to step out of that discomfort and step a little bit more into my authenticity. And
Okay.
a lot of that is, for me, a lot of the examples are looking back to the gender equality within the workplace, and the way that women, including myself, were treated in a number of workplaces I worked at. And there are ways that I could have safely stepped up and said, hang on a minute, I'm really not comfortable with that, instead of maybe playing along with it or turning a blind eye. And so I guess my piece of advice back to me would be to notice when you don't feel okay with something.
Mm,
And that might be something, sometimes it's fear, but as often as not, it's because you aren't being your authentic self. You're out of alignment with what matters to you. And so for me, it would be just notice. And when you start noticing things, you start changing them. You
mm,
often don't even have to make any real conscious choices to change your actions, just by noticing that actually wasn't okay, or that didn't feel all right, or I didn't like the way that you spoke about that other woman, or, you know, whatever it is. Just by noticing, you will start to act differently. And so that would be my bit of advice, is to notice and listen. What is it that's making me feel uncomfortable here? And is there anything that I can do, however small, to start changing that? Keep myself safe through that process, but just make some small changes around that area rather than trying to suppress. I think we try and suppress it, don't we?
yeah, and I think you're totally right there, because it's all about just that recognition. S- Subconsciously will do so much more, because you don't even necessarily have to communicate that initially, do you?
Yes,
But if you're aware that it's happening,
yeah.
it kind of snowballs from there,
It
doesn't
does,
it?
yeah. And it creates this change within you. And I had a situation a few years ago where I was talking to someone and they said, Joe, you need to stop being so emotional. Now, I'm not an emotional person. I've had therapy for the fact that I struggle to show my emotions, and I
Mm,
definitely wasn't being emotional. What I'd said was, well, this doesn't feel great to me. And that's what I'd said, you know, it was very much, this doesn't feel great to me. In the moment when I got that, you need to stop being emotional, it kind of gave me a physical response, like it kind of made me tense up a little bit.
mm,
But it wasn't until afterwards, until I got off that phone call, that I went, hang on a minute, that's a bias that's being shown to me. That's
yeah.
you know, a microaggression that's being directed at me. And just that act of noticing it means that in the future, if anyone has ever made that comment, I have acted in that moment to say, I'm not being emotional, I'm expressing to you what matters to me. Whereas had I not noticed it, had I not picked up on that kind of physical change in me when that was directed at me, I would still have just kind of rolled in that moment. So you're right, it happens automatically without us even noticing once we spot the thing that makes us uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really nice way to sort of summarize a lot of the things that we've discussed, because it starts with making and taking some action, doesn't it?
Mm.
And you only have complete control over you. So it we are where we are. But I just want to say I really appreciate all of your sort of time and effort in pulling this together. And I'm sure that this will spark a lot of conversation and a lot of interest. But what I will also do is I will pop a link to for people to get in touch with you if there's anything that they'd like to delve in further. But yeah, thank you ever so much for your time today, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I've loved it. I mean, like we said earlier, I think we could talk about this forever, couldn't we? But it's been great to catch up and have that opportunity to have that chat.
Fabulous. Well, thank you ever so much, Joe. And yes, I will speak to you again very soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.